So your modern mirrorless camera can get super sharp, oh so crispy clean video, but what if that's not the vibe we're going for? What if we want to shoot something and make it look convincingly like it's from the 1910s through the 1920s, with all of the idiosyncratic imperfections that come with it? We decided to take a day and recreate a very period-accurate look at what selling a camera to B&H's used department would have looked like in 1915, and we wanted to share some of the tips and tricks that we did to get this effect in case you're trying to do something similar for your own video. Now we're going to be using Canon C80 for this, but these principles will pretty much apply to any modern mirrorless camera. Now video, to put it very mildly, has changed a lot from where it was some 100-odd years ago. Beyond the obvious things like color and image quality, things like film and sensor size, aspect ratio, and frame rates are all different, so let's break them down one at a time. Let's start real macro though with what we're capturing and how we're doing it. Now these original black and white films we're trying to emulate were often shot on 35mm film on things like Bell & Howell wooden cameras. These are more or less impossible to find now, so really any recreation of this look is gonna have to be done digitally. Now since we're emulating 35mm film, a Super 35 sensor size equivalent is a great starting point, which luckily this full frame C80 can shoot in, although Micro Four Thirds and full frame will still work fine. Also regarding camera movement, we're going to want to keep our camera on a tripod. Gimbals, Steadicams, and handheld shooting were definitely not a thing back then, so keeping your camera movement period accurate is a subtle way to keep the immersion. Finally, we got to talk about lighting. Now lenses back in the day were often not as fast as they are now, so sets would often use super bright, super large tungsten lights that were diffused and often further away from their subjects. Now due to our timetable we had for this edit, we ended up not being able to replicate this lighting technique exactly, instead using our standard studio setup with our LED nan lights with a standard key, fill, and hair light. But if you're striving for authenticity, stopping down your lens and flooding your scene with harder and warmer light will go a decent way towards adding to the authenticity. Although one thing you probably have noticed already is that we were able to kind of duct tape over a lot of these shortcomings with a lot of image distressing in post-production. So as I'm sure you've already guessed at this point, a lot of the magic of this look is gonna happen in your NLE. Now we're gonna break down exactly what we did step by step, and we're gonna do it with our editor for this short film, Scott, who also starred in it, and as you can clearly tell, is a master of art and subtlety. So Scott, do you wanna change places?
Well, the first question you asked was like, hey, should we actually be like undercranking the camera? Should we be shooting at 18? And I said, well, no, because I think with something like this, because we never know what sort of problems you're gonna, come into. So I think it's best to shoot at, a normal frame rate and then, make the modifications in post. Because, you just don't know what you need to work with until you're working with it, and things come up. So yeah, we captured 23,976 and then made the adjustments in post. And the first step of that was using the Posterize time effect on every clip to put it at the 18 frames per second rate, which does give like a very nice jittery effect. And I'll go ahead and copy a clip towards the end of the timeline to sort of give an idea of that, but also remove the time adjustment that I gave it, for example, so that we can see what it looks like just with the Posterize time effect. And then we'll get back to the speed change in a second. And so here is what the clip looks like with just the Posterize time effect. And you can sort of see the stutter here that does give that sort of, weird undercranked feel of 18 frames per second. But with something like this, especially creating a look that is reminiscent of a time period where nothing was standardized and equipment was a bit janky, and some of these cameras also, rely on, hand cranking, which means very inconsistent rates. Oftentimes when we watch the footage, people don't necessarily make the transition super well, and it often gets played back at a more modern frame rate like 2397, which means that the footage comes back faster. And I don't actually know myself how much that actually played when it was airing originally at the time, but now we expect that. So I also, besides just the Posterize time, which gives you that nice stuttery effect, we also expect the footage to be played a bit faster. So I sped every clip up between 10% and 50% to give sort of that sped up feel that we expect from this footage. Again, it's like a pretty subtle effect, but I do think that it reads, to my mind at least, a bit more like something that I would expect to see from the time period that we're trying to evoke. So we did shoot in C-Log 2 to give us, a decent amount of color information to work with, and like just, camera data to work with in general to have sort of a flexibility in post, even if the flexibility that we're looking for is going to seriously degrade the image. It's always best to have as much information as you can. So yeah, that was how I did the edit in Premiere, but I think that the part we're really most interested in is building the look itself, which was done in Resolve just because it's like so much more robust and the effects are a lot more fun to play with. So here is how we started. You see here, this is our like normal ProRes or this is our normal C-Log2 files straight out of camera. You can see that it's a bit flat. So as with everything in Resolve, we're gonna start with the color space transform. And this was on the group pre-clip level. And then if we go to the group post-clip level, we'll go ahead and enable this last node here, which is the color space transform output. Oh, right, there we go. So there we go. This is, normal looking footage with the color space transform. So let's go through the rest of the nodes. So on this first node is where, I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of this old-timey footage didn't have color. It was in black and white. As far as I can tell, all of the footage was. There's no way of knowing. So this first node, we desaturate the image. And I actually have it in the color space HSV and just brought the gain down, which is a nifty little trick that I learned off YouTube. And then in the next node, I did some contrast adjustments just to make it look, a bit more normal. And this is the same way that I would sort of treat any footage. And then after that, we start actually like getting into the look. And the next node that we're going to enable is the contrast pop. Just because I tend to think of this footage as being very, very contrasty with a lot of this look, because the equipment and the processes were not necessarily standardized at the time. Unlike what I would do for recreating a different sort of look from a different period, I was sort of going a little bit more vibes-based with this one, just because there is so much less consistency. And you are sort of playing with our current perception of it and not necessarily how it would have been viewed at the time. So I just sort of played around with the contrast pop effect until I was happy with it and I liked the way it looked. After the contrast pop, the next effect that I threw on there was the lens distortion, because lenses at the time were quite a bit more flawed than they are now. And so here, obviously, we have sort of more of a circular warp around it, but also playing with the color channel distortion, which gives sort of this chromatic aberration effect, because that is, I think, like a pretty common issue at the time. So you can see, even though it's black and white, there's still like a bit of green and magenta, sort of shadowing here on the details around Sam. Which, that color detail will be lost a bit later, but I think that it still gives a good sense of sort of what the aberration that was common at the time was. Moving on to the next node, we have the film damage, which, I think this is where we start to really see the effect here. Here we added, some vignetting, some film blur, a bit of a temperature shift, because a lot of this footage wasn't just black and white. There was always like a bit of tint to it, or at least the way we see it now, there was a bit of tint to it. And so, playing around with the tint shift and temp shift, tint shift, added some vignetting, because I think that that's like one of the most sort of noticeable things there. So, with all of this, I was just playing around with these sliders until I felt like I got a good look. That I quite liked. And then some dirt. Again, I imagine that wasn't super present at the time, but when we think of this footage, it is certainly noticeable, a very noticeable aspect of it. So you can see these sort of dirt specks coming in here, as well as these sort of film scratches, these linear film scratches, which again, I think is like a very important sort of part of the aesthetic that we come to expect. Moving on to the next node, we have the film look creator. Now, here is a thing that was sort of part of my process here. I've, in the past, like sort of experimented, especially like in my free time, with a lot of look creation. This film look creator thing is, oh geez, what a revelation. Very, very much simplified the thing, simplified the entire process. Because yeah, from this node we can start with the core look of this vintage thing, play around with the skin bias a bit, and then color settings, change the exposure, don't want it too blown out. That was one that I was sort of tempted with because I do tend to think of these as being quite a bit blown out. But I think that you get sort of a similar thing by tweaking a lot of the other settings, like your contrast. You're going to get like a lot of sort of the contrast separation that you would normally get from the exposure, especially playing around with like highlights and stuff. So I wound up nixing my exposure sort of changes and relying more on sort of the nitty-gritty of this other stuff. Split toning, this sort of creates this sort of varied look that you see with a lot of the older footage, where there is that color cast to it. And then I think I did double up on the no, I didn't double up on the vignetting, that's good. Halation, again, I think is pretty important to a lot of this thing, although I did go pretty subtle with this. But it does add like a nice blur, and I think really is pretty key to mimicking a lot of the imperfections of older lenses, as same with bloom. It sort of gives a bit more of a washed out look, and I think really especially accentuates like a lot of the skin tones. And then of course we have the grain, which would be one of, I think, people's first go-tos what they think of with the older footage is like a very heavy grain. I did actually go a bit subtle with it here, just sort of for readability's sake. We could have gone way harder with it, and I think that going a bit harder with it would have probably been a bit more accurate, but also I think a little bit distracting, and would sort of undo a lot of the look for everything else. So I did spend some time tweaking this to get it so that it was apparent but not distracting. Same with flicker, playback here with the flicker really does do quite a bit, and it's kind of hard to see with the screen record because there are so many effects on here, but I think you can still see a bit of this flicker effect that does become more apparent once we get into Premiere and do the speed adjustments. That's it. That's the end of the node tree. We did it, folks. I had a lot of fun making this look. Again, this is one of my absolute favorite ways to spend a day, is to have one of these sort of very stylized things where I get to use all these effects that I would normally never get to use because they're so gaudy and ostentatious. I'm comfortable with the amount of research that I did to sort of emulate this look, just because they were imprecise at the time, so I feel like it gives a lot of license to be imprecise now, especially considering the only way that we really know about any of this footage is heavily sort of distorted, degraded films. So it's kind of hard to say what it would look like in the moment, even if we were like, going off of fresh film and, using the cameras today, did we look into what it would take to buy some of these cameras in the film stocks that would have been accurate at the time? Are you saying B&H doesn't sell like the Bell and Howard 1920s film cameras?
I think in their little museum section on the second floor, I'm sure there's something along those lines. But no,
I was joking, but that'd actually be really cool.
That's one gap in the used department.
It was genuinely a lot of fun to try and replicate this 100-year-old look, and it really got our gears spinning on all the other subtle and intricate ways we could have made it even more period accurate. In fact, it made us kind of want to tackle other film looks, such as 1950s Panavision golden age of Hollywood cinema, or 1980s shot on video, or any period in between, all on a modern digital camera. So if there's a video look from a specific time period you'd like to learn how to emulate, then let us know in the comments below and we'll tackle it next. But until next time, I'm Nick with B&H. Stay creative.